Welcome back to Neon Liberalism. I'm Samantha Hancox-Li. And for the past several weeks, I've been doing a Liberalism 101 series here, talking about the historical roots of liberalism, the fundamental principles of the liberal project, to try and answer this question, why be a liberal? Uh, but admittedly, this is all pretty historical in scope and in some ways doesn't yet approach the question of, like, well, what about today? Right? What about the world we're living in and the problems we're facing? Does the liberal project have answers for the crisis that we're in? Um, and so to try and start answering that question, I'm really excited to have on Adam Gurri. Adam, founder and editor-in-chief of Liberal Currents, our captain through all these stormy seas. Adam, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess liberalism in the 21st century feels like it's in crisis right now. Um, and I guess I want your take. Like, what's the shape of the crisis that we're in right now?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects, and one is sort of world historical, and the other is national historical. Um, World historically, um, I think almost every system is struggling, and in my mind, that is a natural consequence of something that, as a first order thing, liberals should say is an unhedged good thing, which is essentially the spreading of wealth, the spreading of the fruits of the Industrial Revolution, or whatever you want to call it, um, to the rest of the world. But also within the developed world, we've gotten extremely rich at this point over the last 200 years. So both wealth as an abstract concept, in terms of having resources, but also the specifics of even a fairly poor person in either relative or even absolute in today's terms, um, has access to communications technology that can instantly communicate and coordinate with people anywhere. Um, uh, Transportation technologies that can move them very quickly around the world, or even within smaller spaces, even faster. Um, Meaning that um, it is extremely hard for any system, from the very totalitarian to the very democratic and open, to uh, govern itself because
Sorry, there's a cat. For those who are listening along at home, there's a cat that is attacking my desk right now. He's made off with something. Yeah, the third crisis afflicting liberalism is that cat. But sorry, you were saying
no, it's
well,
just
communications devices.
the bottom line. Liberalism has always cared about difference in terms of like taking it seriously, but difference matters more now than ever, because very small groups are capable of having a very big impact relative to any other point in history, just because they can both everyone's capabilities at every scale have increased, right? Small groups can be quite nimble, so it's hard to clamp down on 100% of them for any system. Um, and even democratic systems, even fairly super majoritarian democratic systems, um, aren't going to get unanimity. The very best system is still going to have a great deal of disagreement, and sometimes extremely livid disagreement. Um, and then of course you see this to take it a little nationally. So one of our patrons was talking about the war on terrorism era, of leaks in the CIA and attempts to clamp that down. It's very hard for any institution to clamp down leaks. It's just so easy. I mean, a cache of files can be shared just so easily now. What's hard is hiding who did it. So the flip side is surveillance is easier, but leaking is also easier. And yeah, so I mean, institutions governing themselves is very hard. Never mind governing the rest of society. Um, so there's a general crisis that is not specific to liberalism, in my view. Um, that is just what happens when actually you approach the Marxian utopia of You have actually spread the gains from productivity gains and such much more broadly than before. And the frontier of technological capability has been pushed so far in absolute terms, but also far in distribution terms to people who have access to it. So that's one thing. And I think people underestimate that aspect. They want to tell very specific American stories. That is one reason why liberalism is in crisis around the world right now, because at the end of the 20th century, liberalism went through an enormous victory and spread further than it ever had before, which means that it was among the most vulnerable to reversal. Any reversal that was going to happen was going to reverse more democracies than non democracies, probably. Um, um, so the democratic recession, as they call it, has a lot to do with that. We just had a big democratic boom, and therefore we were in a position to have a big democratic bust. So that's part of it. A sort of reflexive, whatever you have now, um, opposition against it is going to be more effective than in the past. The other aspect of it is in America, we had a very consolidated victory for the New Deal plus Great Society type liberalism. Um, and for decades, it's been a very long process. Um, Conservatives have been chipping away at that, and part of that is conservatives chipping away at it. Perfectly fair, part of that is conservatives chipping away at it. Part of it is that it was poorly implemented in some ways to begin with, and so it was feeling the strain. But the bottom line is that by the time you get to 2016, a lot of those institutions are already in crisis for various reasons. Um, so that's the long, not exactly the short of it, but one
No,
shortish
there's a
version.
lot in there that I think is really interesting. Um, and I guess to try and, work through this piece by piece, one leftist response would be to like stop you immediately and say, wait, you think wealth is broadly shared? It's precisely the opposite, right? We live through a time of deepening inequality, and you can point to PKD's numbers about, both wealth inequality within nations and wealth inequality on a global scale. Um, that seems to have been steadily increasing for several decades now. And like that's the cause of our problems and our crisis is inequality and the overweening power of global elites.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Um, I do think. I mean, you wrote just recently about the roles of billionaires sort of poisoning a political, a polity. That is a huge problem here in particular. Um, but in terms, my pushback is that in terms of absolute wealth, um, things have definitely improved, both in developed countries but especially in developing countries. So I'm probably going to get the statistic wrong, but I believe that in like the year after World War II, maybe even the 2 years after, American GDP was something like 80% of global GDP because the other big economies had been destroyed by the war, except for us. And the rest of the world was just dirt poor. I mean, we really underestimate just how poor what we now call the developing world was in 1945, 1946. So there's been huge gains. And I mean, yes, they've been unequal, but the bottom has definitely risen a lot. Or even if you want to be more granular, you could say that like forgetting the bottom 10%, the like 30 above that is doing incomparably better than so there's my argument isn't everyone's great now and everyone everywhere is rich, but more specifically that enough people are richer enough and have access to enough technologies that expand their capabilities for working in groups, to make it difficult to govern. Not really making a specific moral argument that everyone everywhere definitely is now wealthier and better off, and that's great. I do think lion's share of people are definitely better off than they were, but the narrow argument I'm making is simply a broad enough section of society of almost every society in the world is now well off enough to make trouble for big institutions.
Okay, so I offer this critique from the left. I think that people from the right would also want to jump on you a bit here and say, well, you're talking about a global malaise, but that's not true. There are countries out there that are doing great because they've embraced like correct reactionary ideology about the family and about culture and about national strength and unity and development. And like, just look at Hungary or look at China, or look at Russia, that their societies are cohesive and hanging together and they seem to be governing well. What do you say to that charge?
I just think that's not true. I mean, Hungary is a teeny tiny country that its entire existence economically depends on its integration in the EU, which it rails against. If the EU decided that they were going to stop putting up with that, I mean, the EU collectively has the power to destroy the Hungarian economy. Their success is on being sort of parasitic on the EU's general level of wealth and being a very small part of it. Russia is just not a success story. I mean, compare Russia to Poland. Poland, even in Poland, has its governance problems, obviously, but Poland has been mostly democratic. They are backsliding a bit, but they're certainly not Russia, and they've been growing as fast as South Korea. Russia is just a middle income country that is, you know, it's still dying off demographically in terms of just what everyone is going through, but more so for them. Um, they're just they haven't that's just flat out wrong about Russia. I think the right wing argument is mostly about what they hope will happen in the future, or just delusional about what the facts are. But the facts are not within there. China, of course, they they definitely grew very rapidly. They are still probably no more than middle income on a per capita basis, and not really currently looking like they're going to overcome that hump. But who knows? I mean, the future is uncertain. Um, Bottom line is, I also think that their quality of governance is pretty overstated. They're very run through with corruption. Their model is also getting worse as we speak, as Xi has consolidated his personal control of the party and institutions, which leads to all kinds of predictable problems, as we know, unfortunately, as we're seeing here now, as well. But I honestly don't think anyone does have a model that has worked, especially not like a big country. You can usually like pick out specific small countries that have something that kind of works for them, but they're not a very open society in the sense of they don't have a lot of immigration. They don't have necessarily a ton of like tourism as a percentage of their population. Like there's like small isolated examples where they're okay compared to everyone else. But if you're talking a country that's got like 30, 40, 80, 100 million people, nobody is really like cracked this problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It's always important to not overfit from these weird outliers. Like you can't run the world like you run the UAE or like you run Singapore or
Or
for that matter like
Estonia.
you run Hungary,
Yeah.
right? Like Hungary has a GDP that is, I think, smaller than the city I live in, Pittsburgh. And I invite all listeners out there to go look up what fraction of that GDP is just purely subsidies from the EU.
Yeah.
Um, you should look that up yourself. The number
Yeah.
is,
It's
is
like
quite striking.
subsidies from the EU and selling things to the EU, right? And
Yeah.
like
Uh,
them being able to move and work in the EU and send money, like those these the combined like economic relationship with the EU as a whole.
Yeah, so I guess I fundamentally I agree with you
Yeah.
that what we're seeing is not doesn't feel like it's just a crisis for liberalism. It doesn't feel like it's just a crisis for America, but it does feel in many ways like there's a worldwide malaise. Like people are dissatisfied with their governance and their government and their country all over the world. Um, I mean, we see this in the recent European elections where Harris loses, but also just incumbents lose
Yeah.
all across the Western world. All of the incumbents get turfed out, right or left, because people seem like they're unsatisfied with the
Yeah.
way things are going, and they keep on electing somebody new to try something different, and they don't like what happens after that. So it does feel like we've entered this moment where there's a kind of intellectual exhaustion. and an absence of a vision of where to go. Um, so I agree with that, all of that. And one thing I also wanted to pick up from your opening remarks was this idea that that we've inherited this FDR LBJ package of liberal ideas, and it's been under attack from the right. But you added that there were some structural problems that might
Yeah,
not actually even be working on its own terms.
yeah,
And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
yeah. Maybe that, and as we're talking about this, what I'm thinking back to is the parallel is the progressive era, because they had the same feeling, which was, from 1870 to 1890 or something, just the level of growth that occurred then, but also the level of corporate consolidation, um, was unprecedented in human history, never mind American history. And the governance problem they faced then mostly was there were all of a sudden the birth of these gigantic private entities that had really the governing power of like a federal department or something or more, run by essentially these like CEO kings and owners. Um, and that was a serious issue for them to face. The progressives went through this area of, they felt that the liberalism they inherited was very stale for addressing the problem at all. And there was this period of creative, um, a long period of creative figuring out what to do before they actually got into power. Um, arguably FDR actually being the one to finish what they began with, like Wilson and Roosevelt. Um, but yeah, I forgot what was the prompt that led me to that response.
What are the problems that, like you said, that there are structural
Oh, the
problems with
structural problems. Yes.
yeah.
So, for example, the one we always love to go to, local control. Um, part of the model of we're liberal, we're democratic, we want to bring power down to people is having these smaller and smaller local units that have a lot more power, which is something that occurs mostly in the middle of the 20th century. Um, and probably an easier one in a similar vein is um, environmental laws that now make it difficult for us to build green energy and things like that. Can you think of a more counterproductive? But also just in general, like a lot of the welfare side of the Great Society, and like the stuff that was targeted at addressing racial inequality, a lot of it was just very. I just remember like there was a meme during the 2020 primaries with Kamala Harris, because she said she was going to like subsidize black entrepreneurs with Pell Grants. Like it was like there were like three or four things you had to do before you subsidized it.
Yeah, no, I
Um,
remember that one. It's
right,
like, yeah, we're gonna have favorable loan conditions for
right,
black
exactly.
entrepreneurs
And
in
and
historically disadvantaged neighborhoods that are available through
right.
like
And
yeah.
like the LBJ administration just loved stuff like that. They just did tons and tons of programs like that. There's a book that is in like a public policy classic called Implementation. It's got a good. It's like Why Dreams in DC, founder in um, Why Dreams in Washington, founder in I forget. It was somewhere in California. Anyway, the point is there was this huge federal program. They're like, okay, we got to go in to um, to the city in California, which is like a boiling point of racial tensions, and we just have to invest in black employment specifically. Um, and they just had this incredibly convoluted process to attempt it. And the money is never even spent, and the program never even gets off the ground. And this is one of those funny things where some political scientists did this argument where they're like, oh, hey, this one town didn't have riots when all these other similar cities did. Maybe this program really worked. But then you look at the details, and the program never did anything. It never got off the ground in implementation. And so this was used as a study of how, like, just because you write the program, just because you pass the law, just because you say you're going to do it, doesn't mean something actually gets done. Never mind what you want to get done. So it's the LBJ administration especially really liked. I mean, I say liked. There were political compromise reasons all these happened, obviously, but it really went for these like 20-step, very targeted programs that were so complex that they never got off the ground at all. Um, so there's a lot of that in the government, and some of those actually worked, right? Some of them were less complicated like that. There's a whole package. Other things I would say are more like uh, the partnership between the federal government and higher education for both the twin goals, sometimes maybe often in tension, of making higher education accessible to the masses and making higher education a vehicle for expanding the scientific frontier, being on the scientific frontier globally. That partnership was already getting really stodgy by the like it was still calcified by the end of the 20th century for a number of reasons that probably I don't even understand half of, frankly. But I think it's pretty obvious to anyone that is looking at how it was operating in practice, with things like tuition exploding on the access side, um, and actual graduation rates stagnating, even though people are taking on more and more student loans and things like that. And then on the science side, it's just getting very bureaucratized in the pejorative sense, not in the good sense of routinized. Um, so right now we're defending that system, or wanting to, as it comes under just sort of blunt force attack from the Trump administration. But it already needed to be reformed. I think that's pretty clear. It was already in a place where it wasn't. We weren't. We 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 were investing a lot of money, but probably not nearly as smartly as we could, um, in science, just because there was a sort of inertia to the whole thing over multiple decades, plus a slow chipping away at the capacity level of it.
Yeah, so there's a phrase I really liked from this book called Ghetto Side that says, South LA was facing a crisis of simultaneous over policing and under policing, where on the one hand, like the police would just mess up your day because you were walking funny. On the other hand, like murders mostly went unpunished. And so I think it's interesting to see what you're talking about in that vein as like a crisis of simultaneous over governance and under governance,
Yeah,
where on the one hand, we have an enormously effective regime that prevents people from building stuff, right? Whether that's housing or whether that's green energy. On the other hand, we have a regime that, like you're saying, well, we're pouring money into certain programs, but it just doesn't seem to be coming out the other end in terms of results. Whether that's higher education or science funding, or there's another one of these great examples from housing because I'm a YIMBY and I know all these stupid things, where California passed this program to hand out, I believe, $300 million. I might 300 or 30. That's actually an important difference right there, but a really substantial amount of money to like subsidize first-time home buyers in the
right,
state, and like that money disappears in about a week,
right,
and it is claimed by maybe 1,000 households.
right,
Right, so it's a huge sum of money that mostly goes to like increasing the price of housing
right,
rather than generating new construction or getting new people into homes.
right. And then the flip side, I think you talked about um, some mass transit initiative that they had there for, I think, rapid transit in California, where they spent all the money and nothing happened, essentially.
Well, I mean, that's the high speed rail
Yeah,
is grinding away for a decade now.
yeah,
We still don't have, it doesn't go anywhere. They're building parts of it, but it doesn't go anywhere.
yeah,
Um, right. There are many projects that we could talk about here
yeah,
where we're spending genuinely a lot of money,
yeah,
and just do not seem to be getting what we want out of it.
yeah,
Um, so so this is interesting to me because what you've offered is a relatively technocratic diagnosis of what's going wrong. Um, One that I happen to have a lot of sympathy for, but I'm curious how you think that links up with the vibes, with
yeah,
the malaise
yeah,
that I'm talking about, both like the mass malaise, but also the elite, like the hollowness of the elite commitment to
yeah,
liberal ideas that I've talked about before on this channel.
yeah. I mean, it's never as straightforward as just here's a material problem and here's why there's a cultural reaction. I do think, like with higher education specifically, the way that that has become so completely toxic in either people aspiring to work in it or students aspiring to graduate from it, um, uh, is a point that produces resentments. That is part of it. Another part is democratization has sort of run its course for a lot of countries, right? Like so, um, we we finally enfranchised African Americans and minorities after the Voting Rights Act. You know, not perfectly, but we got pretty as far as we had ever gotten. And then in Europe, you know, there are waves of democratization, especially like after communism. You finally get it. But when you get democracy, when you finally get to as democratic as you can be, which I'm not saying that we are, but you know, pretty far in the democratic responsiveness of public institutions, it's just kind of disappointing. It's not like the end of a movie where you've defeated the empire and you know they live happily ever after. It's life continues on. People still hate each other. You know, they're still racists, even you know, even though we beat Jim Crow. Like you know, there's a number of things. Um, these problems don't go away. So what happens is um, people who tend to think you just need X, Y, and Z in order to improve these problems. Once you mostly get X, Y, and Z, and those problems persist. I mean, that's the whole reason that critical legal studies exists, right? Is because the civil rights movement was so overwhelmingly victorious in a number of ways. Yet at the end of the day, still, like even to this day, the situation of African Americans in this country remained pretty terrible for a number of reasons. Racism didn't go away. Like there's so critical legal studies was all about what is there beyond just getting them the right to the vote. You know, why doesn't this translate into why didn't that put them at parity? You know, so that and you have it becomes a question like when they were being outright disenfranchised, you could say give them the vote. You know, that'll be a start. But once they have the vote, and still there's huge inequalities between races, and there's still attitudes, and police still overwhelmingly are assholes to them and not to whites. You know, comparatively, you know that there's a disenchantment that can happen, in other words. And for a generation that is born after you get the accomplishment, the idea that just just having the vote and just politically organizing that stuff is enough probably rings even hollower. So you know, maybe it's a cheap answer, but I would say the persistence of very difficult social problems, plus the fact that living in a democracy, having free speech and other freedoms, doesn't actually mean that the things you feel most intensely about, the things that you know, the problems that you see or the values that you have, are necessarily the ones that are going to carry the day. Um, uh, you know, that's all. I mean, that's again sort of a half answer in the sense that that's always a problem. There's always people disenchanted for that reason. But I do think there's something to the third wave of democratization, or whatever it was categorized as, ran its course, and it's not like the world was really transformed as a result.
Yeah, so I recently read a blog post by Jonathan Corman about the social justice détente. And this idea that coming out of the really bruising civil rights struggles of the 60s and 70s kind of settles down for a while after that. And he argues because there was this kind of a truce, where on the one hand, you had social justice activists and what they got out of it was like a lot of de facto or de jure rights to not be discriminated against, a real change in like public culture and public opinion that were like going to tamp down on like explicit expressions of bigotry and racism. Um, and from there, you know, from that perspective, from the perspective of 1980, that's a really big step over where we were in 1950, where you had utterly pervasive cultural prejudice and, you know, very real, very murderous legal regimes reinforcing that prejudice. But on the other hand, on the other side, like the reactionaries kind of got something too out of the détente, right? They got, well, it's still kind of going to be a country that's dominated by white men. in positions of like actual de facto power, politically, economically, culturally, socially, still going to be kind of a white man's republic. And you're also just not going to hear as much about like agitation for big fundamental change.
Yeah.
And that holds for a while, but then, like you say, the world moves on, people move on, and they no longer like it's no longer enough to be better than 1950. We want to
Yeah.
be better than 1990,
Right.
right? Like it's that like, and on the other side of the equation, Barack Obama gets elected.
Right.
Um,
Right.
right, and like there are genuine material changes in like the structure of power and the structure of the population in this country that like make the reactionaries kind of insane. um, so I can certainly see that as part of a story about why that consensus is broken down, and probably for good reasons.
I mean, I think Alan Elrod said that the South was never really reconstructed. Like they never really like. At the end of the day, the former Confederacy still votes very predictably for race baiters. you know,
Yeah,
like it's pretty.
no, I think that's quite right. Okay, um, so I guess we've been kind of meandering through these questions of malaise, uh, but I want to be also maybe a little bit more hopeful about it,
Yes.
and to
Okay.
ask you, like, well, what do we do,
Yeah.
right? Like, and in particular, what does liberalism as a philosophy have to offer us in this time
Yeah.
that's like better at solving any of these problems than the right or the left?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you touched on a lot of it over your series, obviously, but difference is not going away, and difference is getting more important. And the only philosophy that's really built around the assumption of difference is liberalism. Um, there's some left pluralist ideologies as well, but I would say in terms of like a whole governance package, liberalism is the best. And reactionary ones, the whole idea of nationalism or any reactionary ideology is essentially that you deal with difference by getting rid of it, which is just not possible. I mean, it's just not possible. It's a delusion, and it's a delusion that leads to genocide and ethnic cleansing. So liberalism is not that, but beyond that, yeah, right. But beyond that, we actually address it, right? Like when I talk about liberal democracy, um, uh, I talk about um, so there's the practical side, which I know that I lean on a little too heavily for the question you're asking. But on the practical side, if if the average individual is more capable, and small groups are more capable, then you have to take them into consideration. You need a system of government that actually builds in feedback mechanisms for when they're unhappy, and brings them to the table and has people that represent them. So even, this is why specifically unitary executive is bad versus legislatures as executive is as representative institutions, because even if you don't have the majority, you have a representative who is only representing some segment of the population of which you are a part, that is there at the table, that can have some influence, um, and so there's that's the democratic side, but the
So,
liberals, sorry, go on.
well, I kind of want to interject here. And if you read what the reactionary right kind of writes about this stuff at their high church publications, like they're also in many ways very alive to this crisis of overgovernance and undergovernance. And their diagnosis is like actually it's precisely the legislature that is the problem here. It's precisely all this structure of government and consultation and this shareholder and this stakeholder and this committee review, and we just need a strong man. We need they wouldn't say Codillo, but we need a Codillo to like take power, to take personal power with his personal muscular will to just ram stuff through and get things done.
Yeah.
Right. And like I think at least some people find that very appealing
Yeah.
in this time of malaise. So what would you say about that? Like, why is that wrong?
Yeah, I mean, that's always been the dictator's talking point, right? Like that was Mussolini and Hitler sort of mocked the chaoticness of parliamentary politics of their day and talked about just being people who got things done. Fascism was supposed to be the thing that made trains run on time. But the reality is not that. If you have one person who's decisive, most of the time what they're going to be is just decisive for their own interests and the interests of the people that keep them in power. That's just like it's the most predictable thing in the world, right? Um, we like to point to dramatic examples like Deng Xiaoping or something, or Singapore, where just the right guy in the right time and place managed to institute things that got things better. But how exactly do you plan for that? The whole process of picking the person is the problem in the first place. And then the problem after that is how do you pick their successor? And how do you pick their successor in a way that doesn't blow up everyone? And well, really, either side of that. How do you do either of those choices without turning the whole country into a civil war? Um, or, if not a civil war, then a perpetual insurgency and political violence. Um, uh, and non-democracy just does not have an answer to that. Now, perhaps elected strong executives are one answer, but the problem is that elected strong executives don't really like to be term limited. They don't really like to be limited by laws in their actions, um, and unless you have institutions that actually protect those things from an executive, you're going to get personalism, and it's going to turn into a dictatorship of some kind, even if like a hybrid system. Um, so that's my answer to that particular point. Um, but if I could say about like, so that's the democratic side, right? Um, but the liberal side is really about how what how how the citizens relate to each other. It's a substantive point of view, right? Democracy is how you pick the laws, but liberalism is what we think the laws ought to be. And part of those laws should be just your basic package of human rights, um, because the way that you deal with difference is to find domains where you don't have to make nation level or even like state level collective decisions about things, and let people organize themselves, let people make their own choices. Um, not dictate, or let individuals reflect their own values, to the extent that you can. And people think this is an apolitical. Like, I think there's a criticism of liberalism that says it tries to take politics out of this. But my argument is the only way you defend this is through politics. You have to have a substantive liberal politics that says individual rights are important and good. Um, One reason for that is because it reduces the temperature of of uh, of what is decided through legislatures and things like that. Um, and it's frankly just one way of regulating low level conflicts that exist in society between groups that have different values and different points of view. You regulate it by saying they're allowed to do that, you're allowed to not do it, but they're not allowed to keep members of their community from leaving their community. You can have um, Orthodox Jewish communities here, or recently immigrated communities from Muslim countries that have fairly patriarchal points of view, but they can only be here if their daughters are allowed to leave those communities if they want to, and that's a very tense thing. I mean, it is a very that's but that is better than, from their point of view, that is better, and just from a social peace point of view, it's better than the government simply saying you're not allowed to raise your daughter in this patriarchal traditionalist mold at all. Like, you can't, like, that's when it becomes ethnic conflict, essentially. When you attempt to do that heavy handed. And sorry, go on. You say?
No, I think that's. I kind of want to ask you about this heavy-handed thing.
Yeah.
Um, because one of the criticisms you hear from the left these days is, the problem isn't overgovernance or undergovernance or any of that nonsense. The problem is billionaires. The problem is corporations. The problem is concentrated economic power.
Yeah.
And you can do whatever you want on the political side unless you crack that economic power. You're not going to change anything real, right? So we need much more heavy-handed state intervention in the economy, right? We need, right? We want a public developer, or we want social housing, or in certain extreme cases, we want to totally nationalize the housing industry,
Yeah.
or we want to have community, like we want to have the community exercising political control over the developers who are gentrifying that community.
Right.
Right? You can, whatever, the left does not have like a party organ these days where you can just find out what their platform is.
Right.
But this is a general tendency to say, like, okay, the problem is concentrated economic power. Like, what do? You exert state control and political control over the economy, and put the people, and destroy the concentrated power.
Yeah, I think that this is where American liberalism specifically is the best kind, to be completely, biased, in the sense that the influence of the progressives and of FDR style American liberals, um, more or less answers this, right? They like we talk about the welfare aspect of that. But inventing a regulatory state was a huge part of it, and it was precisely because they recognized the exact same thing from that era of the robber barons. It started more with Roosevelt, the first Roosevelt, than with FDR, but this heavy government hand in the economy um, was recognized as a necessity. And this economist who I took at GMU, Arnold Kling, wrote something just a couple of years ago, essentially conceding the point and saying that even conservatives need to recognize the need for regulatory states, and just talking through the basic facts of the complexity of some of these markets and the kinds of spillovers that they would have. So it's not just this isn't so the point that I made about individual rights and toleration, I was thinking more of the social domain. Um, Obviously, we do need economic liberty as well, but what does that mean? Um, it means something different from a private individual, just sort of buying goods and maybe like giving things to people they know personally, um, than it does a giant corporate entity. Um, and it means something different when what the activity they're engaging in is something in industry, like a commercial activity, um, and um, and that's because of the spillovers, right? So if banks engage in activities that are reckless, and pointlessly so. It's not just banks that are going to be harmed, and it's not just their customers that are going to be harmed. Financial institutions are so incredibly interconnected with every aspect of business, here and abroad at this point, that if certain practices are adopted, um, it could be catastrophic. I mean, we saw this in our lifetimes, um, more than once, frankly. Um, so the regulatory state, is not at odds with liberalism, in my view. It's sort of a basic requirement. And again, this is like it's getting pretty technocratic at this point in terms of the argument, but I don't think it's at odds. The whole point, going back to Adam Smith, of the system of natural liberty, as he called it, was because of its ability to turn even private vice into public good. To turn like someone just trying to make a buck into they're actually helping people overall in some way, not even intentionally, and not even just their customers, because of the influence of their actions on other people and such. So, like liberalism has to actually pay attention to whether that's the case and make adjustments accordingly. And I think, frankly, I think that's true not just for economic activity. Um, so Jacob Levy um, wrote a book, Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom, essentially arguing there are two big strains of liberal thought. And one is the pluralist one that just says the way that you get away from tyranny is just kind of like federalism. You just allow as much variation, both locally and across groups, as possible. And you allow that freedom of association to go, crazy, and you disperse political power as much as possible. And the other side says, no, because when you do that, you end up with a bunch of local tyrannies. What you actually need is a strong central government that imposes property rights and imposes freedom of speech, and doesn't let some locality say, actually women don't have the freedom to choose whether or not they are married and whether or not they stay in the marriage. Like we have a law from above that says you have to do things the liberal way. And his basic argument is that neither side actually works in absolute. And my takeaway is we try and get the principles of liberty as best we can, one way or the other, either through the pluralism or through rationalism. And a lot of the rationalism takes the form of actually looking at the empirical system that we get and saying, are people actually free? Are people actually able to effectively make choices and leave in a situation they don't want to be in and gain capabilities to, take control of their lives? And to the extent that they're not, to the extent that things get rigid socially, to the extent that mobility goes down, and to the extent that people feel stuck or afraid, like afraid of trying to rock the boat because of whether it's a political power or a social power, some power needs to come in and actually make adjustments. In the economic realm, that's mostly about consequences. It's not about like morals. But in the social realm, it's about, do we actually effectively have freedom of speech and expression? Do we actually effectively have freedom of association if under a lot of circumstances? Again, the Orthodox community here in New York is a good example. Women who try to leave the Orthodox community with their kids, the Orthodox community pools their resources to get good lawyers who know how to fight these cases. And the woman, of course, has left her community and resources behind. And has very little ability to fight it. That, in my view, is a very noxious dynamic, and one that I wouldn't say like the government should specifically subsidize Orthodox women trying to leave their community, but it would be more like, okay, there's something going on here. There's an exploit that they're doing that makes us need to reconsider how the legal system works for these kinds of scenarios.
So I guess one thing I see sometimes, again, I'm going to bring this back to housing because I care about it a lot, and I think it touches on a lot of the fundamental freedom of movement and freedom of exit that you've been talking about throughout this. Because if you have nowhere to move to, you don't really have freedom of movement.
Right.
But I see on the left, oftentimes when people are talking about gentrification or they're talking about housing, or let me rephrase, when they're talking about the affordability of housing, they start talking about gentrification. And when they start talking about gentrification, they start talking about all of these outsiders who are moving to our community when they shouldn't be and are driving up the rents, right? There are different epithets for them. Usually these days people talk about tech workers, all of these tech workers who are moving to this community and driving up the rents. And it seems like what people want in some cases is something like a system of residency permits.
Yeah.
Right? Are you allowed to live in this community? Well, we're going to check about whether you're an authentic X, Y, or Z, or whether you were born here, or your family was from here, or whatever. And if you don't, then you don't have the correct hue cow, and you got to leave. And I think this is of a piece with what I would say the illiberal left's suspicion of private initiative, right? That ultimately, you talked about Adam Smith, this line about turning private vice into public virtue, but they're suspicious of that process. They're saying, well, we really do need to stop and check whether you've got private vice or private virtue. Right? We shouldn't let people exercise their own economic freedom. And this isn't the freedom of large corporations to spew out pollution or anything like
Right.
that.
Right.
Individual people to move.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you're coming down on that could theoretically be a totally legitimate thing for the government to do. Right? Just gotta evaluate it all on a case by case basis.
Yeah. So I would say, I guess the bottom line is, what is your target? And as a liberal, the target for me is an actually open society where people can move wherever they want and whenever they want. And that's like the high ideal, right? Obviously, there's always resource constraints in reality, but that's the target in my view. And then government intervention should be a matter of, we've fallen too far from off of that. So the idea of, well, people coming here makes it cost more, and our answer to that is we just need to make it harder for people to come here. That sounds like, okay, so you're saying that so rising, I'm trying to like how to frame this in a general way, but like you essentially someone else's freedom of movement should be stopped because the people who are already there don't like the consequences of them being there. I just it's very difficult for me to see a situation where that's legitimate. Um, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Like how could I don't know if you want to pick that up, but it's difficult for me to see how your goal could be allowing people actual agency. So I don't know. I brought up your old feminism with YIMBY characteristics article. You quoted Rebecca Tiffany, and I love this quote so much. She said that
So good.
the ideal for her was every trans 18-year-old who is stuck living with unsupported family is able to afford an apartment in a vibrant urban space with transit in a minimum wage job. Like that, I mean, that's like the one liner. That's a great vision, right? That's a positive vision, and that is, I think, basically the positive vision. It doesn't have to be a trans teen, but it could be anyone who's in. It could be that Orthodox mother. It could be someone who's gay. It could be it
Could be
could
anyone.
it could be a conservative an overly liberal household who feels like, you know what I mean, like or someone or hey, a Christian, a Christian right, a kid, an 18-year-old who's converted to the Christian right and is very uncomfortable living with their parents. That person should have the freedom to go and move and live in a Christian right community if they wish, right? Like it's not just people that we like or agree with. Um, but they should have that freedom. But if that's your target, then the method can never should never, in my view, be make it harder. Like there's no way like the system of residencies and things. There's no world in which you have something like that or even approximating it where you're going to make it easier for that 18-year-old trans kid to move out. That's just not how it's going to work. There's just no way in practice, no way in theory. That's just not how it's going to go.
Yeah, so I like this line that, you just have to understand that the target is an open society. The
Yeah.
target is the freedom of individuals to make their own choices about their lives, whether those choices are good or not, whether you agree with that choice or not, whether you like them, that's like on some level, like that's not really my business.
Right.
Um, and so I guess if that's your target, like what's your program, right, for the world we live in today? Like what are the planks of Adam Gurri thought for a liberalism for the 21st century? What do we like, what concretely, given our world situation, do we need to do to get closer to an open society?
Yeah. I mean, this is like, how long do you have? And also, on the other hand, there's some things that I'm really not the person to give the answer, right? Um, so, for example, I do think we need to revisit the partnership between government, the university, and industry in this country. But I am not the right person to describe what that new version should look like. Like I have ideas on what I want the outcome to be, and but it's easy to wish, right? I wish for a system that it's easy that it's easy for anyone who wants to go to college to go and get an education, and not go broke over it. I want, or even like have lasting financial consequences after they're out of there. Um, uh, I want to continue being on the global frontier of science and technology and research of all kinds, um, in a way that actually is not overly burdened, through administrative steps and things like that. Like I want it to be quick. I want it to be generous. That's what I want. How to get there, I'm not the right person to answer that. On the housing stuff, like I feel like we'll just bore our listeners if we say, but it's like, for me, it's state governments should pass laws like Japan's zoning laws that they do nationwide, which are very simple, and they are zoning laws. It's not like they're abolishing zoning, um, but they make it a lot easier to build. In general, there's a bunch of like different things like that. Um, we're talking about free trade. You had uh, Steve Randy Waldman on. I think his idea of having mostly getting rid of tariffs, maybe not entirely, but like mostly getting rid of tariffs, but instead taxing capital flows out of the country, um, is a good one for making sure you're not having bad macroeconomic effects on things like manufacturing and such that people always talk about, from having free trade, which is good because free trade is good because there are some things that we won't get if we don't have it, right? Um, but also like actually investing in port modernization and other kinds of modernization, like that's, I mean, but these are all, again, these are like big technocratic things. Um, in terms of, I also think we need to do what you've been doing in this series and actually invest in, hey, here's liberalism as a fighting idea. We're fighting for the open society. That's the goal. Um, like, here's some concrete things that happen when you don't have an open society. That trans teen is stuck with their family, even if they're in a place where legally they could be supported for being trans. If they're living with transphobic parents, what are the odds that they're actually going to be able to do any of that stuff? Um, think about any vulnerable person at all, and how would you actually defend that person? Don't um, yeah. Anyway, that's so actually making the case for liberalism as a positive vision of what a society should look like, and how it should operate, is key. And for that, you need media institutions also that actually push that message, which for the most part they don't right now. Um, there's a lot of books by a lot of different people. I feel like there's 100 different books on liberalism this year. Um, Most of them don't really. They're either too abstract or too concrete. They sort of are either stuck in talking to other philosophers, or they're stuck in a very like historical, particularly American, um, but not actually the middle layer of what are we doing? What's our fight? So
No, I mean, I think that's right. I recently read Robert Trositsky's Dictator on Day One about like the fact that Trump is trying to make himself a dictator in America, and I think he lays out the case very clearly. But then the question, like, what would we do about it, is a little thinner. I'm going to have Alex Sakaris on this podcast next week to talk about his new book. Like radical liberty or radical liberalism. I have to double check on what the book title is. But I think that is also going to be, as you say, somewhat more philosophical, pretty far out. Well, not it's not far out. Like as someone who's read a lot of academic books, this is way more grounded than
yeah,
your
yeah,
average piece of academic philosophy. But then I think it's also going to be a little thin on that policy program. Um, so yeah, no, I think you're right that there is like this kind of absent middle ground of like making the case to people in a way that is like philosophical, that is like actually speaking directly to values, directly to this idea of liberalism as a project, as a very important project, but also with like actual details about like
yeah,
what we are going to do, how we are going to fix the real problems that are facing America today. So yeah, I mean, obviously, I think that is an important thing to be done,
yeah.
unfinished task. So, I guess, well, last question. You talked a little bit about the media that doesn't seem to be defending liberalism. Obviously, it's been a big concern of mine, as I just talked about. Like, what's your pitch, right, to the average media elite today? Why be a liberal?
If yeah, I mean, if you're not now, in a few years' time, you won't have the option to be, is how I see it. Right now is the time to stand up for the basic pillars of liberalism in America with everything you've got, with every lever of influence that you have. Or you may find that you don't have the option to in 2 or 3 years' time, for the foreseeable future. And that's just the crisis argument, obviously. But I think if you are in media and you want to remain in a place where you have the freedom to make judgment calls yourself about what kind of message, what kind of stories you want to run, and what kind of tone you want to have, and how you want to frame events or what's newsworthy. Um, if you want to be able to do that without constantly worrying about getting crushed by the federal government, now is the time to be very vociferously pro freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom in general. Um, I mean, it's just a self-preservation thing that I would that you'd think that in the media they would find. But I think, often what you find is that a lot of, I mean, obviously these are businesses, they're all businesses, and the CEO and corporate class is in general, it's not just the media, right? That's been a problem this year. Um, and part of that is they just think, well, probably I can ride this out, and even if things turn out for the worse, I'll probably still be making money. Um, but if you're the New York Times, I'm not sure that's the case, quite bluntly. There's a few people that are just on the enemies list, and they're not going to get off of it by being obsequious. So I don't. Uh, it's a little puzzling how things have played out this year, frankly. Um, but my pitch to you is, if you're not a liberal now, you're not going to get the chance to be later.
No, I think that's right. If you like living in an open society, if you like all those benefits for yourself, like, yeah, it's time to fight for them, and to fight for them for everybody. Okay. So yeah, any last words to wrap up here, Adam, or
Yeah, I mean, I
as your
guess
piece?
in this country and around the world, um, liberalism dealt with a lot of crises and changes in societies. And since we were on the early end of the big transformation after the Industrial Revolution, we wrestled with a lot of the things we're wrestling now 100 years ago, 80 years ago, 60 years ago. And my belief is that the version of liberalism that came down, was influenced through dialogue with the progressives, was politically manifested through people like FDR and LBJ, but also privately, through the civil rights movement and things like that. Um, uh, Came up with the best basic version of the value package, which is, democracy for all, truly democracy for all, and never giving up on tinkering with the particulars of that to try and make it better. Um, Liberty for all, liberty and equality for all, as much as we can accomplish that. Um, but then also achieving that through a lot of generosity and oversight, from public institutions. Um, that's all I have to say on the matter.
Okay. Yeah, Adam Gurri, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.